This video will talk about the process and potential plan of getting passenger rail service to Annapolis, which is the state capital of Maryland. I was motivated to create this after a recent announcement by the Maryland Department of Transportation about studies into expanding MARC train service to additional areas in and outside of Maryland. MARC, or the Maryland Area Rail Commuter, is Maryland's passenger rail service that serves Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and areas out towards western Maryland as well. It is the state's equivalent to commuter or regional rail. I grew up in Maryland, and so I still take note of any projects happening back home. Realistic or not, I still watch and still hope. With that, let's get into the potential routes to get towards Annapolis. So, all of the potential routes run from Odenton, Maryland to downtown Annapolis. Odenton has an existing MARC stop and is along the Northeast Corridor. However, only MARC trains stop here, and Amtrak trains merely pass through on their way to either Baltimore or Washington, D.C. With this connection, trains running to Annapolis could be operated in either two ways. First, it could run only between Odenton and Annapolis, meaning all trips to Annapolis originating from anywhere outside of this new route will require a transfer. Or, trains could operate as one-seat rides between Baltimore and Annapolis and or Washington, D.C. and Annapolis. This second option would likely work better for multiple reasons. To start, by not having to transfer at Odenton, demand for this route both to and from Annapolis would be higher due to the ease of use that comes from having a one-seat ride. There wouldn't need to be instruction on how or where to transfer to Odenton, nor would there be time spent waiting for another train. It is simply more approachable for the average user. Besides user experience, there is demand for travel between the two large cities that is not present at Odenton. With Annapolis being the state capital, and Baltimore being the largest population center in the state, this is helpful for government workers commuting to the city, as well as acting as a symbolic link between two important areas for the state as a whole. And a connection to D.C. would be helpful because the U.S. Naval Academy is located in Annapolis. Obviously, there's a value to linking one of the country's premier military academies to the federal capital. Another important fact that applies to both cities is that Annapolis has a sizable tourist industry based around its colonial town center and boating access to the Chesapeake Bay. A car-free link to Annapolis would unlock more tourism demand in Washington and Baltimore. Getting back to the map, let's take a look at the actual route. So this route is about 15 miles or 24 kilometers. It could be plus or minus 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers depending on the specific route chosen, but generally I'll stick with the 15-mile figure. For the most part, this route follows the historic passenger rail route to Annapolis. And yes, there used to be a passenger rail service to Annapolis. 2 services, in fact. The Baltimore and Annapolis Railroad, whose line ran down the Broadneck Peninsula and then crossed the Severn River into Annapolis, and the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Electric Railway, which ran the line from Odenton to Annapolis. I chose this specific historic route for one simple reason. This route is far more realistic to achieve than any other, especially because the costs of tunneling or elevating portions of this route are not feasible for the expected ridership. This leads me into a quick tangent about right-of-way acquisition and the idea of fantasy routes proposed by people in general. While researching for my own video, I came across another video by How We Get Around that also proposes passenger rail service to Annapolis, showing 3 potential options. Link to the video is in the description below. Some of the potential routes to Annapolis include a DC Metro expansion, MTA Light Rail expansion, and a more traditional commuter passenger rail branch or diversion route originating from New Carrollton. I like the creativity from these options, but must admit my frustrations with feasibility as well. Most of the proposed services either run on streets or in highway medians, which makes right-of-way issues less of a concern. These portions are sensible and realistic. There are also heavily tunneled portions in relatively minor population centers. This one example I have on the screen proposes a deep bored tunnel approaching from the west and leaving north. It is immensely frustrating because the old right-of-way is right here. It is very clearly visible on the city design and on easily obtainable right-of-way. Why is this not being utilized? Now, I don't point this out to throw shade or criticize this particular creator. I point it out to highlight my frustrations with people opting to design these elaborate but completely out of touch with reality fantasy routes rather than exploring more realistic options. And I understand many call them fantasy routes because they know they are unrealistic, and I still respect the time and effort put into designing them, but it is just my personal gripe that I have. With this in mind, let's check out what the historic right-of-way has morphed into today. Using this lovely website called openrailwaymap.org, we can see exactly where the old electric railway tracks used to be. As you can see, much of this route has become state roads used for automobiles, especially here near Crownsville along Generals Highway or Maryland 178. Other portions have become right-of-way for utility lines, such as this portion near this mall, and some have been converted to recreational pedestrian trails, such as this section near Poplar Avenue. Once again, when you see it, it becomes very noticeable where old tracks and right-of-way have been in the past. When possible, as much of the historic right-of-way should be used because oftentimes it is the geographically most efficient route to use, as well as one that fits well in the existing community design. The start of the line breaks off at Odenton from the north side, although there is room for a break-off when approaching from the south as well. After breaking, the line crosses two major roads and continues on to BG&E right-of-way. BG&E is Baltimore Gas and Electric, the electricity provider in the region. Following BG&E utility lines, the route continues shortly along Patuxent Freeway before leaving the road and approaching down towards Maple Road. This is where we join the historic right-of-way. Following these roads, we eventually reach Crane Highway. This is a potential park-and-ride stop with close access to I-97. However, work will have to be done to grade separate the rail from the road. Continuing on, we reach the South Shore Trail and follow it, still along the historic right-of-way. This area will have multiple at-grade crossings, which will require crossing signals at the roadways as well as sound barriers throughout the residential neighborhood. We follow the trail until reaching I-97 where the more grade separation is needed and continue on to our first alternative route junction. Now, the historic right-of-way continues along the Red Route, but this becomes General's Highway, an important local road. Any rail services through here would have to be built parallel to the road and have lots of at-grade T intersection crossings. Think like Brightline in Florida. However, the population in this area is low, and property acquisitions are not too high, so it could work. I will talk more about the cost of property acquisition later in this video. There is also the possibility of a potential station by the county fairgrounds, as well as room for a park and ride. In my opinion, the blue route is more achievable. This follows BG&E electric lines all the way down towards Parole. The right-of-way is already there, and there is no need to purchase properties unlike the other route. Once either the blue or red route reach the outskirts of Parole, a choice must be made on how to continue to Annapolis. The red route continues along BG&E right-of-way until reaching a small cemetery. If this route is chosen, there will almost certainly be the need to exhume the interned individuals and move them towards other burial areas. This would no doubt be very controversial. The route then crosses Bestgate Road and continues south. These small residential properties would need to be acquired and bulldozed. Then, the route continues past the medical center along a local creek. There would need to be drainage and runoff improvements made if the line is to be built over the creek. The medical center is also a prime candidate for a stop, being such a large center of employment. The line continues until eventually rejoining the old right-of-way near Poplar Avenue. Two commercial properties would need to be acquired and bulldozed for this last portion. This route is a bit windy, but avoids a lot of potential right-of-way conflicts. But the yellow route could be a potential opportunity. This giant building here is the Annapolis Mall. When researching, it seems as though the mall is plenty active and not slated for demolition anytime soon. There has been talks of adding dense housing in the parking lots of the mall as well. However, if the mall were to decline in the future, this site would be primed for redevelopment as transit-oriented development, or TOD. The train could potentially run directly through where the mall was, and new mixed-use development could be built around the station that would be placed here. But if the mall is here to stay, there is possibility of routing the track along the western side of the mall and rejoining at the historic right-of-way near the junction of US 50 and Maryland 450. Partial property acquisition from the mall and full acquisition from nearby businesses would be needed for this. After crossing US 50, the route continues parallel to West Street before joining where our red route rejoins the historic right-of-way. This final portion is a straight shot towards Annapolis. Sliver acquisitions from businesses here would need to be obtained to fit track, and then Poplar Avenue would need to be shifted to fit track as well. We continue to follow the trail next to Poplar Avenue before reaching Taylor Avenue. The police department's parking lot would need to be moved slightly. Then, we follow this access road all the way to Washington Street where the line ends. Here would be Annapolis Station. I envision platforms along both sides of the track, with the station itself being constructed where these current businesses are. They would need to be acquired for construction, and so too would some land from this apartment building to fit platforms. This station location is ideal because it is as close as you can realistically get to downtown Annapolis. It is a 10-minute walk to the State House in Main Street, 15 minutes from the city docks, and 20 minutes from the Naval Academy. All are very walkable. So this route has its challenges, but is still very far within the realm of possibility, especially when considering that this route requires the least amount of new track construction. It is the shortest possible distance to an existing passenger rail link. Other routes, such as down Broadneck Peninsula, require large amounts of property acquisition, unless you run down the middle of the highway route, which presents logistical and signal nightmares, especially from a vehicular collision standpoint. Other routes branching off from further down the Northeast Corridor, closer to Washington, present high construction costs for tunneling, elevating, and bridging, not to mention the pain that comes from building rail through massive highway interchanges, if you choose to build in the highway median, that is. The closest thing to a historical route is the most reasonable, thanks to construction of roads, utility lines, and trails in its place after disuse long ago. Regardless of the route, though, finances will be the principal concern when considering if this rail service is even feasible. So let's take a look at some numbers. Property acquisition costs stack up quick. I took the time to poke through the county GIS and property value assessment data to see how much buying needed properties would cost. This table here represents how much it would cost to acquire needed land and space in each individual property for this straight shot segment we talked about earlier. While some properties are total acquisitions, other are only partial, and only a small percentage of land is needed. And so, I calculated using the land value times the percent of land needed to come to a potential price. All in total, it would cost in the realm of around $11.2 million to acquire needed land just to our first junction. I didn't even want to imagine how much the yellow route would cost if the entire mall was redeveloped, so I focused on calculating just the red route. This table, which shows property acquisitions up to the blue route junction, are all total acquisitions, and so calculating was much easier. I just added the total property and improvement assessment values. This portion would cost in the realm of just over $32 million. Land isn't cheap, unfortunately, otherwise I'd own a house by now. I didn't bother to calculate the rest of the route since it was just single-family homes from time to time, but it's safe to say that the rest of the route would probably also be in the realm of tens of millions of dollars too. For some quick math, the average home price in Anne Arundel County is $500,000, and so to acquire just 100 homes would cost $50 million. The dollars add up quick. Luckily for us, the rest of the route is relatively rural and mostly avoids needing to buy residential homes, but there are a few. So for this exercise, we'll say we need to buy 50 homes, which ends up being $25 million. This brings our final acquisition cost to $68.2 million. Next, we need to figure out how much building the actual track costs. And by we, I mean I need to find an academic paper that tells me how much it costs to build track. Turns out, that's a lot harder than I thought. There's all kinds of variables that go into calculating track costs. Like what speed is it rated for? Is the land flat, or is it hilly? Is the area urban, or is it rural? Are there lots of bridges, lots of tunnels? There's a lot to consider. Luckily, I found something that sort of answers what I'm asking. This paper, by Jeffrey Tyler von Braun, gives us cost estimates of building rail track per mile, and he goes into great detail about his methodology, as well as completing an existing literature review. From my uneducated read over the paper, it felt very thorough and appropriate to use, and so I chose to use it. Specifically, I'll be using numbers from Table B4 found in the paper's appendix. This table lists the cost to build double tracks in a primarily plains environment. It is further broken down into land use, meaning whether the area is urban, suburban, or rural, as well as being broken down into track speeds and whether or not the track is electrified. For our route, I chose the 79 mile per hour rated electric track in an urban land use area. So that means it should cost almost $11 million per mile to build track. Not entirely terrible, but this paper was written in 2011, so we need to inflation adjust our dollar amount. This comes out to be $15.7 million per mile in 2025. And at 15 miles of new track, our total track construction cost would be $235.5 million. That's a lot of money, but in the realm of public infrastructure, quite manageable. There are still additional costs to consider though, including station construction, environmental and engineering studies, the cost of utility adjustment when running under utility right-of-way, paying a small army of lawyers to handle any legal challenges, funding community outreach, and not to mention purchasing the actual rolling stock as well. I can't pretend to know how much all these items cost, but I also can't pretend that I care enough to figure that all out either. So, I'm just going to take a wild shot in the dark on these additional costs and just stick with that number. Somewhere in the realm of $500 million feels appropriate. That brings our total final cost to $803.7 million. I have little knowledge of how much something like this should cost, so please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Either way, my figure lands at the final cost of $53.6 million per mile of track. Besides the obvious financial costs previously mentioned, there are legal, political, and public opinion obstacles too. First, not every property owner may want to voluntarily sell their land for this project. This means eminent domain may be on the table, which means time spent in court. There will also be the expected lawsuits by members of the community looking to oppose the project. Like most train projects in the United States, there will inevitably be legal challenges. Politically, there are issues too. While Maryland is a supermajority Democratic state, That does not necessarily mean that local representatives will be okay with the project. It is not viable or worth wasting political capital from the governor's office to force projects in a local district that opposes them, even if the rest of the state is on board. And of course, there is the ever-present obstacle of public opinion. Various citizens may be opposed to the project for a variety of reasons. Some may think the cost of the project is not worth it. Some may think the train will bring crime, poverty, and homelessness. I can already hear the comments. The train goes to Baltimore? I don't want them anywhere near us. And there may also be concerns for noise or traffic caused near at-grade crossings. So we've talked about a lot, but there's still one point I want to address, and that is why specifically Annapolis? Why not serve another community in Maryland? Frankly, there's not too many other areas to serve. Much of Maryland's development has unfortunately been mass amounts of suburban sprawl, which aren't conducive towards public transit. The area between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. is almost entirely suburban developments. These create a huge last-mile problem that is difficult to solve, which is why it's important that the Annapolis station be as close to downtown as possible. And luckily for us, much of the suburban sprawl hasn't made its way in between Annapolis and Odenton. Annapolis is one of the few population centers that isn't entirely sprawled yet. It has an old, town center core that is perfect for a rail link. It is also one of the largest population centers not yet served. The only comparable areas that also don't have passenger rail service would be Hagerstown in western Maryland, or Salisbury on the eastern shore. Most of Maryland's largest areas, such as Baltimore, Frederick, or some of the towns around D.C., are already served by some form of passenger rail. Annapolis is next up for passenger rail in Maryland, and it's had it before, so let's have it again.